Hi, everyone. Welcome. To start off our lectures, I want to basically give you some background about the Ottoman Empire, and specifically to talk about all the different peoples that were part of the empire. Again, one of the major points here is that the Ottoman Empire is not just Turks, right? The Ottoman Empire is not an extension of Turkey, even though the language spoken, the people ruling it were Turkish speakers. The language spoken was Turkish, and the people ruling were technically Turks, even though they wouldn't call themselves Turks. They would call themselves a different name that we'll go over. Um, and in fact, it was an empire. What that means, that was full of different peoples. It covered a vast expanse of territories, all sorts of different areas and different ways of organizing them. And so what I want to do is just give you a sense of what's out there. Who are the different peoples that were living in this period in time? Now, the usual way that people might break this down is by religion and sect. And this is the way, we often talk about the Middle East in general. The Middle East is a space of religious animosity or sectarian fighting, Christians against Muslims, Jews against Muslims, uh, Christians against Jews, et cetera, et cetera. But really, and I'm not undermining the role of religious identity in the Middle East, but I think we should maybe start somewhere else. First, let's just think in general, what would people call themselves? How would they identify themselves? If you were to go up to some person in the Middle East in the year 1600, um, how would they, if you ask, who are you or what are you, what would they respond? One thing they would definitely not respond with is the idea that they are of a nation, right? So that they are Turkish or Arab or Bulgarian or Syrian or any of these things. These didn't mean anything to them at that time because these weren't real nations as the way we see them today. In fact, those are identities that were born out of essentially 19th century um, ways of organizing peoples and territory, where there's a close connection between people and territory and identity. Now, what they might say is that I'm from this village, or I'm from this area, I speak Arabic or something like that. But that didn't necessarily mean this because they spoke Arabic that they would see a connection with every other Arabic speaker. And the same goes for religion. They might probably religion being Muslim or Christian might be the most salient kind of universal identity that they had, but it wouldn't be the only way that they would identify themselves, and it wouldn't mean that there was naturally a solidarity. One way to think about the types of identifications that people had is to not look at religion, but let's start somewhere else. Let's start at basically even perhaps a more basic distinction that was going on, which is between nomadic and settled groups. Now, nomads, as we'll talk about, are people that move around and essentially move with animals and raise animals, bringing them to pastures in different areas. There are not many nomads left today. In fact, nomadic groups are dwindling almost to none. There are many settled groups of people. Those settled groups today are predominantly in cities, but in this period, we're talking about the vast majority of settled people lived in rural areas on, farming essentially. And a small percentage, probably 10%, 5% in some periods, etc., were living in cities. So we have a very rural population that's settled and an equally important and large, and as we'll see, very powerful nomadic population that is moving. Now, in the period that we're talking about, um, there's many different types of nomads, many different groups. They speak different languages. They do different types of animal husbandry, but they're mostly moving about. Also, just a point of fact, these are not hunter-gatherers, right? Hunter-gatherer peoples essentially disappeared in the Middle East uh, quite a while ago, uh, basically between, I think, 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, with the rise of kind of larger centralized states based on farming and irrigation. But at this point, there's still many nomadic groups, certainly, and these nomadic groups are raising animals in and moving them about, and this is really large numbers of animals. They go by different names. The most common one actually was Turks. So actually in the period that we're looking at, to call someone a Turk meant to call someone a nomadic Turkish speaker. Often this is used the word Turkoman. Alternatively, there was the word Yörük in Turkish, Urban, which is from Arabic, meaning, Arabs. Again, if you called someone an Arab, you meant not someone who speaks Arabic or is an Arab in the way that we think of it today, but probably someone who is a nomadic Arabic-speaking nomad. What do nomads do? Are there any left? There are actually a few. Basically, there's one tribe, the yellow goat people, called the Sarı Keçililer in Turkish. Sarı is yellow, Keçi means goat, li is the adjective suffix, and ler is the plural. Yellow goat people, they are the last remaining nomadic tribe in Anatolia, and I think from this video, it's just probably from 2010 or so. We have a set of, let me turn on the volume so you guys can hear this.
In the dark hours of dawn, they rise. A long day awaits them. They tear down their home and walk for hours before once again settling. They are the last Anatolian nomads called Serikecibi, a term that means the ones with the yellow goats. As the last of their kind, they carry a dying culture, a legacy of their ancestors. The Serikecibi nomads treasure life and the environment.
Dünyanın varoluş bu coğrafyasına tanıklık ediyoruz. Şahitlik ediyoruz. Yoldaşlarımızla birlikte biz de onların bir parçasıyız. Bu heyecanı birlikte tadıyoruz. Birlikte yaşıyoruz. Var olan bu değerleri gerçekten hayatın sonsuzuna kadar götürme çabasındayız. Bunun için bize yaşam sevinci diyoruz.
There are only about 8,000 Serikecibi nomads still living their traditional lifestyle. Every spring, in small groups, they pack all their belongings and livestock to migrate from the coasts of the Mediterranean to the plateaus of Anatolia, walking long distances, grazing their herd.
The needs of the animals define their way of life, but it's more than that for the Serikecibi nomads who believe they have a unique bond with their livestock.
Yoldaş gibi bakarım ona. Yani kendim mesela canım kendi çocuğum gibi bakarım onlara. Çok severim. Çok severim. Tabii ona da kızdığım zaman da olur. Öfkelendiğim zaman da olur ama kıyamam. Aç kalsa susuz kalsa yani ben ona hayır olmam hiç. Biz ona bakarsak o da bize bakar. Severim yani.
Their daily routine is not easy, walking from 8 to 35 kilometers depending on the terrain, weather, and the condition of their herd.
Vallahi işte nasıl geçsin. Sabah erken kalkarız mesela çayımızı demleriz. Erkenden yani. Şimdi malımız da yatmıyor. Aşağıda olsa yani kışladığımız yerde de oturduğumuz yerde olsa mesela ilk hareket ettiğimiz yerde yatar o zaman ağıl dolu mal. Havlusunda olur. Erken kalkarız çayımızı demleriz. İşte buraya hemen hayvanımızı yaparız. Çobanlar malı sürer gider. Biz de evimizi, çadırımızı yıkarız, toplarız. Göçeriz işte yola devam ederiz.
The process of putting up their tents and tearing them down again every time they move to another place can be tedious. Each Serikecibi family does it almost 200 times a year.
Her şeyi biz yaparız, kendimiz yaparız. İşte ekmeğimiz yiyorsa mesela yufkamız yiyorsa onu, hamurumuzu yoğururuz, onu atarız. Geçiler sağacaksa geçileri sağarız. İşte böyle. Çamaşırımızı yıkarız yolda.
But for most of the nomads, this is an irreplaceable lifestyle and modern life feels suffocating.
Düşündüğüm zaman mutsuz oluyorum. Mutsuzum. Birkaç gün kapalı mekanda değil, 1-2 saat kapalı mekanda bir konuşma için bile olsa, bir toplantı için bile olsa fazla oksijen alamadığımız zaman beynimiz çalışmıyor. Şehirdeki insanlar 3 yıldızlı, 5 yıldızlı, 7 yıldızlı yerlerde konaklayınca zannediyorlar ki kendilerini modern bir hayatta yaşadıklarını zannediyoruz. Ve bizim konakladığımız evlerimizde o kara çadırımızda buram buram geçmişten
kadimden gelen kültürümüzde yıldızlarını sayamazsınız.
But their nomadic existence has recently
Okay, I'm going to stop there. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that these people are not constantly moving. They're moving between different pastures, specifically a winter pasture and a summer pasture, the summer pasture in the mountains, the winter pasture closer to the coast, which is, we'll see, facilitated by the structure of the Anatolian geography. And you might not think that these people are particularly, let's say, threatening or a force. And in fact, at this point, they've basically been eliminated by most governments because governments don't like people that move. They like people that are settled, that pay taxes, that can be controlled and don't run away or fight too much. But in pre-modern societies, nomads had a military advantage. For example, just by the very fact that most of the people involved were trained in some basic form of warfare, were highly mobile, or relatively rough and ready, and used to riding animals, specifically horses, to camels, and therefore could easily adapt to become cavalry for future campaigns. And this is, of course, also something that occurred in numerous places, not just in, as we'll see, in Anatolia, but occurred again in China, the constant back and forth between Turkic invaders and the various settled populations in China, also in Russia, and also in Europe, the Huns and the Avars and all those other types of people that were migrating into different parts of Europe, and on occasion conquering and settling down in different ways. And of course, there is another model within Islamic history, which is the Arabs themselves. Initially, the Prophet Muhammad came from a set of basically a nomadic background, in this case, a tribe of Arab nomads that were not completely itinerant. They would settle down in a city. That tribe is called the Quraysh. That city was Mecca. But there was, essentially a large general culture of nomadic groups that moved around and basically fought each other and did minor amounts of trade in different ways until they were able to organize and unite themselves and then become a major force of conquest. Now, the nomads we're interested in are basically Turkic nomads. And Turkic nomads, there's a whole variety of them, moving in different ways and shapes and forms, having different languages and so forth. But they basically come out of Central Asia, somewhere kind of between Mongolia and Kazakhstan today. And in this general area, there's a large amount of steppe land, so area that's particularly useful for raising large herds of animals. And they have been migrating into different areas for essentially almost 1,500 years, right? So from 200 BC, we have records of Turkic migrations in different ways and shapes and forms, both into China itself, but also in this case into the Middle East, and more specifically what eventually would be the Ottoman Turkish migrations that would set up the Ottoman Empire. That said, nomads are not meant to be, let's say, just predatory on settled communities. So it's not just agriculturist versus pastoralist, or more poetically, the sound versus the desert. It was often more of a symbiotic relationship. Nomads rarely continuously attacked and destroyed agricultural communities, and often what they had is a sort of set of trading relationship, because nomads had what settled agricultural communities didn't have, which is animals. It was very hard and very expensive to raise animals back in the past, unlike today in the world of factory farming. They had large amounts of animals. That means they had access to meat, to wool, to dairy. With that wool, they would also be able to create wool cloth and carpets and things like that. They would be able to create skins and hides for leather. And with it, of course, meat all sorts of different dairy products, which were preserved in different ways. And so they traded that with agricultural communities for things like grain and other things that they needed. At the same time, at different points in time, when basically nomads found it more useful to be predatory, had a particularly, could create a monopoly on safe passage, or were in charge of an area that was particularly transited through, for example, the Hajj route between Syria and Mecca and Medina, they could continuously raid and attack caravans and settled communities. And it was almost impossible to control them, because the moment you sent an army to confront them, they would basically they would run off and disappear into the desert or into the mountains. And they were, again, a highly militarized, highly mobile population that was difficult to control. The best way for a state to control nomads was to pay them off, or to essentially pay off one of the tribes to essentially keep control and peace in an area. And that's why states also try to generally settle nomads when possible, that this was really very difficult. There were different attempts to do this in the 1600s and 1700s, but it was really until the 1900s, 1800s, 1900s, that different pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists, were forced to settle down, whether that's the case in North America with the various Native American tribes that were forced to adopt settled lifestyles and reservations, and the rest of their traditional lands taken away from them, or in the Middle East, where nomads were also forced to settle down in agricultural communities and stripped of the lands that they traditionally wandered in. Now, the area we're looking at and we're most interested in is this Anatolian Plateau. And this Anatolian Plateau is basically part of a larger Eurasian steppe. And as you can see here, this gray area marks land over 1,000 meters. So what this means is that it's very good for having a summer and a winter pasture. The higher altitude land is green and has full of grass during the summer. The lower altitude land on the coast is very good during the winter. So if you're a nomadic group, you can kind of migrate with all your sheep and so forth between winter and summer pastures. And what this essentially extends from is, from Central Asia over here, between kind of China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, all the way over to essentially Hungary, as you can see here in different steps. And this is just essentially a sort of highway that nomads traversed and migrated across over the course of centuries. And really, Western Anatolia is sometimes the perfect mixture of summer pasture and winter pasture, with this access to the sea lands and the higher alpine steppe. And then the pressure kind of came to head already in around the year 1070. One group of Turkic nomads called the Seljuks had moved as a kind of mobile nomadic empire, taken over what is essentially Iran, and then also eventually Baghdad, and was the Abbasid Empire at the time, and controlled most of the Middle East. Now, these kind of nomadic Seljuk family, Turkic-speaking Seljuk family, also had a whole variety of other Turkic tribes that they had sort of pushed out as they monopolized power, and they were kind of being pushed towards the frontier with the traditional enemies, or at least the frontier with the Byzantines, who controlled Anatolia, and more Turkish migration was being pushed out there. Now, the Seljuks didn't really want to fight the Byzantines, but the Byzantines used this as an opportunity to kind of basically force a war, and basically marched with their empire, an army out to go and meet the Seljuks. The Seljuks kind of gathered up the army, and there was a disastrous and complete defeat of the Byzantines in a battle called Manzikert, which is essentially on the border between Turkey, Iran, and Armenia today, or I guess Azerbaijan. And This was a major defeat for the Byzantines, and it very quickly opened up the interior, the steppe of Anatolia for Turkish migration. And in fact, basically all Byzantine defenses in Anatolia kind of collapsed. And for the first 2 decades, there was basically Turkic tribes moving all the way into the sea areas, etc., attacking different places and so forth, raiding, moving in with their large herds of animals. In fact, some of the earliest, basically the earliest Turkic inscription or piece of evidence that we have of Turkish presence is a tombstone found in the wall of a Byzantine castle over here in Antalya. That was basically repurposed for building material. And so we have, that's the earliest kind of written presence we have of known of Turks or Turkic speakers in Anatolia. Very quickly, though, a sort of sister or step dynasty of the Seljuks kind of established themselves in Anatolia, and they call themselves the Seljuks of Rum, or at least that's what we call them now. They were kind of technically independent from the larger Seljuks, the greater Seljuks. They called themselves Rum, which was the Arabic word for Rome. Why was Anatolia called Rome? Because this Rome is what they called, and the Romans were what they called the Byzantines. This area was known as the lands of Rome because it was a form of Byzantine area. And so they called themselves Rum. And eventually this would become the word that people, Turkic speakers from Anatolia and the Balkans called themselves. They called themselves Rumi, which literally means Roman, because they came from the lands of the Romans, in this case, the Byzantines. The Seljuks of Rum basically had a capital in Konya. And as you can see, they expanded through central Anatolia in different ways at time between kind of 1077, so quickly after the Battle of Manzikert, to 1194, so a good amount of time, about 100 years. But they were kind of quickly put down, encountered a challenge that they weren't expecting, which is the rise of the greatest nomadic empire in the world, which is the Mongols. Now, I don't want to get into what made the Mongols work or not. You can listen to the podcast about this, and there's other podcasts you can listen about the Mongols. But what we have here is a guy named Genghis Khan, or better known as Genghis Khan in Genghis Khan in English, who was basically able to take different Mongol groupings, rearrange them, and transform them into a massive army that was able to seize large amounts of land and conquer basically China, the Middle East, what is today Russia, but never really made it over to South Asia, and was stopped in basically Palestine when fighting what is known as the Mamluks, who were centered in Egypt. Now, the Mongols have a reputation for being bloodthirsty and killing everyone, and this is certainly the image that the Arabic chronicles give. For example, of the siege of Baghdad, there was a presumption that the Mongols wouldn't dare destroy Baghdad or so forth, but the Mongols were relatively, let's say, consistent in their messaging. If you surrendered and you basically paid tribute, they would spare a city. If you refused, they would lay siege to it, and once when that siege ended, they basically destroyed and killed most of the people in it. This first happened in the city of Kharazm, which is in the border between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan today. It doesn't exist as a city anymore, partially because it was destroyed. The ruler of Kharazm basically killed the emissaries of the Mongols when they sent their demands. And this quickly, the Mongols destroyed the city, and along with it, the ruler and that lands of it. This obviously sent a message to other places to not try to fight back. This happened again in Baghdad, at which point the last caliph, the Abbasid caliph, was there, and he was apparently rolled up into a carpet and trampled by horses. I believe that's how he was killed. And the city was apparently burned. Chroniclers talk about the rivers running red and black with the ink of books thrown into the river, but this is actually kind of a poetic exaggeration. Already within a few years, libraries were back up and running. Madrasas, that is universities and other institutions were refunctioning again. So the Mongol threat was not only one of destruction, but also actually, as we'll see, a lot of creative interaction. And in fact, what they did most actively, besides kind of rearranging all the wealth in the Eurasian world and reconnecting it, is they moved people around. So they took Persian engineers and sent them to China, and they took Chinese artisans and brought them to the Middle East. And in fact, the Mongols are basically the moment of a complete restructuring of the canon, of the values, and of the ideas of kingship, of science, and of rulership throughout the Middle East. But that we won't get into as much right now. We can see the Mongol Empire already by 1259. They had essentially eliminated the Rum Seljuks, as you can see here. And this was the Mongol Empire had split up because Mongols, like many Turkic Turco-Mongol polities, practiced something called tanistry. So they would split up the empire amongst all eligible male heirs. In this case, there were two sons and two uncles, I think. And so the empire was split into the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, which is Central Asia, the Ilkhans, which ruled Iran and the Middle East, and Anatolia, and the Emperor of the Great Khan, which is the richest one, which was in China. As I pointed out, the fact that all of this area all of a sudden was connected and now was easily transversible by all sorts of people led to basically a gigantic transfer of knowledge and artisanal crafts and ideas from China into the Middle East and vice versa, more from China to the Middle East. And in fact, there was even a Mongol passport, which you can see here in the bottom here. And this is also the period when Marco Polo is traveling to China, partially able to because the Mongols had connected everything. The Mongols have another product, or at least consequence for us, something completely unintentional, is that in the process of uniting and basically conscripting all the different types of Mongolian tribes and all these different people into their army, and again, initially they were just nomads, but then they quickly picked up siege weapons and other types of soldiers, etc., and created these massive coalitions to take down cities like Baghdad. And in fact, when they attacked Baghdad, they not only had their own armies with their siege engines and different regiments of troops, but they also had the help of Crusader armies and Armenian kings and a whole variety of other people that came to decide to join their coalition and attack Baghdad. Now, in any case, what this did is pushed out a whole bunch of other nomads, partially because the nomads were just able to move, and so they fled the Mongols. But they also being pushed out because the Mongols just needed a lot of animals. They had, each Mongol warrior basically required a few horses and then kind of a family of at least 5 other people that could support him. So they moved with a ton of people and with animals. And so when the Mongols came to Anatolia, they actually, I think apparently stationed like 1 to 2 million animals, horses, sheep, goats, and so forth, in this area. This is destroyed the pasture land. Everything was being taken by the Mongols. And it pushed these Turkic tribes, which were already in Central Asia, further and further west, and then pushed them right into the border with the Byzantines, or what was left of the Byzantines at the time. And that is the origin of the Ottomans. They belonged to one of those tribes. It's called the Oghuz, you can see here, that fled the Mongols and moved into Anatolia around 1240. So here it is. Mongol conquest around 1250 brought approximately 3 million animals to Anatolia. So, I mean, it's kind of crazy to imagine this many animals, probably more than, or were equal probably to the, I don't know what the population in Anatolia was, but it was probably around 3 to 5 million. So we just had a massive amount of animals all of a sudden pastured in Anatolia, and this is pushing Turkic, other nomadic groups who are not Mongols, who want to flee the Mongols further and further to the edges. Now, we talked about nomads, but we're going to talk also just about other wandering groups. There's other types of nomads. Not all of them are raising animals. Other groups are called the Roma, the Romani. You might know them better as gypsies. Turkish, they're called Çingene. And they've been basically wandering around the Middle East and Europe in different ways for millennia. And in fact, many of them live a sort of nomadic life. This time, of course, without wagons, without tents, but in camper vans. And you can find many of them in Romania. Turkey today has the largest population by numbers of Roma. Though in terms of percentage of the population, it's relatively low. It's about 2% of the population. Though in places like Bulgaria or Romania, they're about 10 to 12% of the population, so a very palpable presence. And like I said, most of the Roma today live in the lands of the former Ottoman Empire: Romania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Greece, Turkey. And today they speak Turkish in Turkey, but there's still different Roma groups in places, mostly in northwestern Turkey. So that is an overview of one split of the population of the Ottoman Empire from nomads versus settled population. Now I want to kind of move into another way of looking at it, which is basically who were the people that these nomads were moving into, what was there. And this area was basically part of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines. They actually just thought themselves as Romans because they were Romans. They were the continuation of the Roman Empire. Here's an image of the Roman Empire where we have, Italy, Italian Peninsula, Croatia, North Africa, parts of Spain, etc. But the core of the Byzantine Empire was basically the Balkans and Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, etc. Now, eventually, I can't remember when, but the capital moved to Constantinople, and in doing so, the empire it basically went from a Latin-speaking empire centered in Rome to a Greek-speaking empire. Over the course of around the year 620, the Byzantine Empire, or 630, the Byzantine Empire ended up losing Syria and Egypt to the new groups of Muslim or Arab tribes that were expanding from Arabia. And really what you have is basically a Byzantine Empire that's centered around Anatolia and the Balkans and parts of southern Italy. And this is really the Byzantine Empire from like 700 to or so. And already by Battle of Manzikert, 1071, you have basically nomads moving into first this area, which has Armenians, and then also this part, which is full of basically settled agricultural villages of Greek speakers, essentially. The Byzantines had a further setback. The Byzantines end up taking back, they lose control of this part, but they take back most of the coast. So they control the coast, but not the interior. And there's constant skirmishes and raiding between Turkic nomads and Byzantine lands. And there was a further setback when the Crusaders ended up sacking the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They sacked Constantinople completely. They basically stole a whole bunch of pieces of it, all the treasures, all the wealth, etc., and carted it back to Europe. They decided ultimately that it was easier and better to lay waste to Constantinople than to try to go back and take over the Middle East from the Mamluks. And this basically set up around 1200, 1204, a Latin empire here. There was an empire of Nicaea, which the Byzantines were limited to. Nicaea is here today, called Iznik. There was a different part of the empire called the Empire of Trebizond, which is operated independently. There was a despotate of Epirus, centered around here in this area, Epirus. But you don't have, you basically have different vassals of the Latin Empire, kind of centered around here. You have different breakaway parts of the former Byzantine Empire. Now they managed to recover and kind of kick out the Latins, get this part back together, but they never really managed to get out of the shadow of this massive loss from the invasion of the Latins. And in fact, they often end up teaming up with the Ottoman Empire, or the early Ottoman Empire, early Ottomans, wasn't even an empire then, to achieve different goals. Now, what this means is that the Ottomans were, as we'll see, one of the Turkish tribes, one of the principalities that was smack against the Byzantine frontier. And they were taking over areas that were basically lands that were ruled by the Byzantines. So one question to think about is, what was the Byzantine legacy in the Ottoman Empire? Did they see themselves as Romans, the Ottomans, that is? Were they continued? How did they treat, how did they regard the Christian inhabitants? Because when the Ottoman Empire, and also all these Turkic groups were moving into this area, the majority of the population was Greek-speaking and they were Christian. So one question is, what happened to these Greek-speaking populations in the wake of both the Turkish migration and conquest, which started again in 1073, and later on we'll talk about the Ottoman one, which started in around 1300, so about 2 centuries later. Long and short of it is that most population of it for the first 2-3 centuries remained Christian. But as we'll see, there was a slow but sure Islamization and slow and process of conversion. This area of the former Byzantine Empire and basically the Ottoman Empire is not solely inhabited by Greek speakers. There's all sorts of other Christians, basically Slavs in the Balkan areas. There's Syriac speakers over here, the border between Syria and Turkey. There's Arabic-speaking Christians in Syria and Lebanon today. There's Armenians, both in historical Armenian, but also over here in what's called Cilicia, Achaia. And in Egypt, there are Coptic Christians. So all sorts of different Christian groups. And in fact, from until basically probably 1650, 1700, the majority of the population of the empire was Christian. And as I pointed out, there's Armenians. Armenians have their own alphabet. They're one of the older Christian groups. It's an alphabet. They also had basically all sorts of different holy sites structured throughout Anatolia, and eventually also migrated to many sorts of Ottoman cities on the coast in different ways today, and then eventually became a major trade diaspora. And ultimately, because of the genocide during World War I, were also spread further out across the world into different places, including many in California. As you can see in this map, right? So today there's many Armenians in the United States and Russia, where they basically went through the Soviet connections and the Tsarist connections, but also in Iran, talk about that, and other parts of the world where they migrated. France is another major area. Coptic Christians, another group of Christians, they live in Egypt. They speak and write in Arabic, but they also know Coptic, which is essentially a continuation of ancient Egyptian. They have their own church with their own patriarchy. And there's, of course, small communities of Jews living in the Ottoman Empire. At the period when the Ottoman Empire starts, there's basically Greek-speaking Jews living in Constantinople and some other cities, but not a large group. There's also, of course, in the Arab lands, which they'll eventually conquer in Cairo and Damascus and so forth, much larger communities of Jews. But in 1492, the year that Isabel of Aragon and Castile and Ferdinand of Castile unite and basically conquer Granada, the last Muslim kingdom of Spain. They decide to expel all the Jews or force them to convert. Many of them fled. The place that they ended up fleeing to most commonly was the Ottoman Empire, which was happy to take them in. And they settled in often in Thessaloniki, Istanbul, and other places. And so after 1492, the majority of the Jewish population was actually Sephardic, that is from Spain, and spoke essentially sort of proto-Spanish. but also used Hebrew for reading and writing. So what we have here is different Jewish sects, Rabbinic, Karaites, different Christian sects, Greek Orthodox, split by languages, which were all under the same church, which is called the Orthodox Church. The Armenians, which had their own church, the Syrians, which had Syriacs, which had their own church, Coptics, and then eventually Catholics when their Catholic missionaries show up. And as we'll see also, there were different Muslim sects, different ways of splitting up the Muslim population. And we'll talk about what was the religiosity of these groups of the Muslim world soon enough. Until next time, I will bid you adieu.